The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the October rain as Harold Whitman drove his well-worn Buick down Route 9. At 62, he'd seen plenty of storms in his lifetime, but this one seemed particularly determined to make the evening commute miserable. The radio crackled with weather warnings, and Harold reached over to turn down the volume, preferring the rhythmic percussion of raindrops on his roof. That's when he saw her. Slight figure stood beneath the flickering streetlight at the bus stop, thumb extended hopefully toward the sparse traffic. Her clothes were soaked through, and she held what appeared to be a small canvas bag, close to her chest like a shield against the world. Harold had been driving this route for nearly 30 years. First as a young father rushing home to dinner with his wife Margaret and their 2 boys, and now as a widower who took his time getting back to an empty house. He'd passed countless hitchhikers over the decades, always with a polite wave and a silent prayer for their safety. But something about this girl's posture, the way her shoulders curved inward, the defeated slump of exhaustion, made him ease his foot off the gas. What would Margaret have said? He wondered, already knowing the answer. His late wife had possessed an uncanny ability to spot souls in need, and she never would have driven past someone standing alone in weather like this. Harold pulled over, rolling down his passenger window, just enough to be heard over the storm. "Miss, do you need a ride somewhere?" The girl looked up, and Harold was struck by her youth. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, with the kind of delicate features that belonged in old family portraits rather than on rain-soaked street corners. Her dark hair hung in wet strands around her face, and her eyes held a wariness that seemed far older than her years. "I don't want to be any trouble," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. "No trouble at all," Harold replied, gently. "I'm heading toward town. Hop in before you catch pneumonia." She hesitated for a moment longer, then hurried around to the passenger side. As she settled into the worn leather seat, Harold noticed her shivering and reached back to grab the old wool blanket he kept for emergencies. "Here, wrap yourself in this. There's a thermos of coffee if you'd like some still warm from this." "Morning. Thank you," she whispered, accepting both offerings with hands that trembled slightly. I'm Sarah." "Harold," he said, pulling back into traffic. "Harold Whitman. And before you worry, I'm not going to ask you any questions you don't want to answer." For the first few miles, they rode in comfortable silence. Harold kept the radio low, playing the kind of gentle jazz that Margaret had always loved, while Sarah sipped coffee and gazed out at the rain-blurred landscape. He stole glances at her reflection in the passenger window and recognized something he'd seen in the mirror during those first months after Margaret's passing. The look of someone who'd lost their anchor in the world. "My grandmother used to say that rain washes away yesterday's troubles," Harold offered quietly. "Never quite believed her until I got older." Sarah turned to look at him, and for the first time, her expression softened. "She sounds wise." Oh, she was something else. Lived through the Depression, raised 6 children mostly on her own when my grandfather got sick. She had this way of making everything seem manageable, you know? Like no matter how bad things got, there was always tomorrow. "I used to have someone like that," Sarah said, her voice growing wistful. "My great-aunt Eleanor. She taught me to play piano, told me stories about traveling the world when she was young. She always said that kindness was the most valuable currency a person could spend." Harold smiled. "Sounds like your aunt and my grandmother would have gotten along fine." As they continued down the highway, Sarah gradually began to share pieces of her story. She'd grown up in a world of privilege that Harold could barely imagine. Private schools, summer homes, and expectations that weighed heavier than any crown. But recently, she discovered that the family fortune she'd been raised to inherit came with strings she couldn't bear to accept. "They want me to marry someone," she explained, her voice growing stronger with each word. A business arrangement. Really, someone who can help expand the family holdings. They say it's tradition, that it's what's expected of someone in my position. Harold nodded thoughtfully. He'd seen enough of life to understand that money could be as much a prison as poverty. And what do you want? I want to teach music to children. I want to live somewhere quiet where I can have a garden and maybe a dog. I want to choose my own path, even if it means giving up everything else. She paused, then added softly, I know it sounds foolish. Doesn't sound foolish, eh? Oh, Harold replied. Sounds like someone who knows her own heart. They drove through 3 small towns before Sarah asked him to stop at a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. Over plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, Harold shared stories of his own children, now grown and scattered across the country, and the small joys he discovered in retirement. He talked about the volunteer work he did at the local elementary school, reading to children who reminded him of his younger self. You know, he said as they finished their pie, the school where I volunteer is always looking for music teachers. It doesn't pay much, but there's a small apartment above the music store downtown. The owner's been trying to rent it for months. Sarah's eyes lit up for the first time since he'd picked her up. Really? Really? And I happen to know the principal pretty well. We served on the church board together for 15 years. 2 hours later, Harold pulled up in front of a modest Victorian house on Maple Street. The rain had finally stopped, and stars were beginning to peek through the breaking clouds. This is my place, he said. You're welcome to the guest room for as long as you need. Tomorrow, if you'd like, I can introduce you to some folks who might be able to help you get started. Sarah looked at the house with its warm porch light and flower boxes that even in autumn showed signs of careful tending. I can't accept your hospitality without telling you the truth, she said quietly. My last name is Pemberton. As in Pemberton Industries. Harold was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. He'd heard of the Pemberton family, of course. Their name was on buildings and foundations throughout the state. But looking at the young woman beside him, he saw only Sarah, tired and searching for a place to belong. Well then, he said finally, I suppose that makes this evening even more special. It's not every day an old widower gets to help someone find their way home. 3 months later, Harold sat in the front row of the elementary school auditorium, listening to his young friend lead 32nd graders through a spirited rendition of This Old Man. Sarah had traded her designer clothes for comfortable sweaters and practical shoes, and Harold had never seen her look happier. After the performance, she found him in the crowd. Thank you, she said, giving him the kind of hug he hadn't received since his own children were small, for everything. Harold smiled, thinking of Margaret and how proud she would have been of the choice he'd made that rainy October evening. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important journeys begin with nothing more than a simple act of kindness, and the wisdom to know that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, deserves a safe ride home. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, and Harold offered Sarah his arm as they walked to his car. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, they were simply 2 friends who had found exactly what they needed in each other's company. The kindness we show to strangers often comes back to us in ways we never expect. Not as repayment, but as the quiet satisfaction of knowing we chose compassion when the world gave us every reason to look the other way.